Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we got another solo album review. The newest project from Special Interest, Endure. So here's something about the modern era of punk I genuinely like. Genre bending, pop accessibility, no longer dirty words. Now, to be fair, even going back to the genesis of the genre, there was always a desire to make something that stuck out of the subversions and deconstructions of the genre, but it kind of laid in tension with the reality that if it ever got too catchy or too poppy, it could be appropriated by the industry, and one's values might crumble in the face of cold, hard cash, better known as selling out. Now, those attitudes hit their apex in the 90s and 2000s, as punk saw its second mainstream revival, and as always, a little bit more complicated than that. One of the key points of tension was how a poppier or more polished electronic aesthetic became, in my opinion falsely, equated with a shift in attitude or ethics, evidence of mainstream commodification even if they maintained populism. But that wasn't always true. Yeah, selling the revolution from a major pulpit can be a flagrant hypocritical contradiction with some very high stakes, but the high reward is the message penetrating hearts and minds, getting the audience agitated for change. Definitely does not always work, but it can. Besides, that era tended to avoid conversations how guitar-driven hardcore genres and abrasive rage could be just as easily commodified or watered down without changing the sound, or how there was entire subgenres of electronic dance music that had radical politics, often with roots that went back decades in the black and queer scenes. And it's a big reason I like how millennials and Gen Z are way more open to genre crossover and experimentation when it comes around to synthesizing a potentially new, revolutionary sound. So enter Special Interest, a New Orleans-based group that broke out proper in 2020 with a blend of noisy glam punk and no wave that really impressed me with their grinding, pulse-pounding grooves and the canny ability to balance out vivacious sexuality and societal commentary, and how being black and queer, there's a very real overlap between those two to survive. Now, that album, The Passion Of, was one of the best of 2020, and when I heard that Endure was getting even more praise as they took further steps towards electronic music and techno and house without compromising that edge, I was really excited. So how did we endure with this? So okay, this is an album that's actually substantially more complicated to discuss than one might think. Yes, absolutely, it rules. One of the best albums of 2022 was a sort of harrowing, pulse-pounding project that can be deceptively accessible until it hits you over the head with sort of revolutionary firepower that you then realize was in frame the entire time. This is an album that has the same militant spirit of Soul Glow's Diaspora Problems, but married it to a propulsive, seemingly give-no-fucks attitude and populism that gradually reveals the tangible emotional stakes that honestly gives it a lot of heart, and that might get overlooked. In other words, there is a lot going on here where I will admit there were a couple moments that could have easily thrown me and have already this year, but I kept coming back, and man, so rewarding to do so. And the first thing I want to highlight is the shift in sound that I initially implied, bringing in more elements of dance and house music in order to flesh out the noisy, no-wave, and glam punk, and that also came with a shift in the production. The seething, unstable guitar work and jagged drum machines, they're still there, but the focus is driving more towards groove, with Nathan Cassiani's bass work reminding me more than a few times of early Savages a decade ago in that stormy foundation. And while there might be a sonic shift and it's reminiscent of the pivots that some punks took towards dance in the late 80s and early 90s, really throughout the entire 90s, the mix balance feels different this time. The grooves feel burlier with an incredibly fat low end, especially in the bass beats. The guitars spike and squeal to flesh out the melody, and Ali Logout's vocals are considerably more prominent. It's not punk being subsumed by electronic music, but augmented by it. And Logout herself deserves particular attention. She's got the searing power of those vintage dance floor house divas and can vamp out with the best of them, but on on songs like Herman's House, her cracking, cackling scream is way more raw, and she'll bend off rhythm just often enough to keep you guessing, or even embrace a more theatrical delivery like on LA Blues, that if anything reminds me of a scene from Derek Jarman's Jubilee. Believe it or not, it was a comparison point that I actually think is worth touching on more later. Stay tuned. And while there are some chaotic, noisy compositions, the howling call and response of Foul, probably the most stark example, although I'd probably also include Impulse Control as well. There was also some cuts where the seething grooves will soften a little bit for humid, borderline R&B dance jams like on the sinuous Midnight Legend or the clattering gothic no-wave of Love Scene. The growl's there, but it's refined until it's not. Now, this was always going to be a nocturnal album, but around Kurdish Radio, the Savages comparison just becomes inescapable, and I intend that as a massive compliment. The bass picks up some incredible smolder as Logout's delivery gets throatier, more martial, and while she will still coo, the undercurrent of barely contained rage feels palpable as the guitars roil and the synths feel chillier. Now, this could have very easily functioned as a bait and switch. When we get to the content, I'll describe why it's not. Or a return to special interest's more slapdash side. And while for Impulse Control, it's absolutely close, especially with how fragmented some of those pianos in the back half are, the polish, the mix balance, it's still here, and you can still easily dance to all of it. But these dances, they're not just as revolution, but driving in service to them. If the first half of the album was pulling you into a fun night at the club, concerning piece is the street fight at 1 a.m. when the creepy identitarian types who got thrown out an hour earlier for getting handsy come back with all their fashy friends and you have to crack heads on the pavement. And after that, hell, I was initially skeptical of the need for an interlude right before the closing track, LA Blues, but the somber guitars interweaving with the keys and the steady beat, there's such a welcome breather as the feedback creeps in and the drums begin feeling oppressively loud that it feels like an incredible grounding moment pulls you back in before the closing piece. Another return to clanking, sizzling no-wave as vintage synths and some howling tremolo riffs well up around Logout's increasingly heartbroken delivery as the pianos will plink off the drum machines for the final emotive climax, an incredibly powerful moment to end the album. But before I explain exactly why that is, let's get back to the content. And it's worth going back to the ideas that Special Interest was exploring on The Passion Of. Now, that was an album that touched on gentrification and poverty, and how both entrap and suffocate the culture and those struggling to survive within that late capitalist paradigm, but also how a liberation can be found simply by living one's truth underneath it, where sheer existence and the open sexuality and the expression through art was its own brand of release, its own revolution. I mean, it was certainly bleak and caustic and bratty, but it never really felt nihilistic to me. Brutally realist, but that can give an audience just enough of what they need. Now, Endure, naturally, is the extension of those ideas, and the recognition that living within the bad systems, it's probably not enough. You need something to galvanize a real revolution. And while you're going to get the moments to entice you through the door, there are some bigger organizational goals in mind. And this is where we might as well talk about that revolution, because especially in the back half of this album, Special Interest are not holding back on the necessity of violence. A foundational line on Concerning Peace is echoing some anti-colonialist sentiments of the past, in which violence might be the only mechanism to change the system altogether. The riot is the language of the unheard. And yeah, Special Interest are not alone in this. I already referenced Soul Glow, but there are rappers like Gais Guevara where you can tell they are disillusioned with the modern brand of liberal activism that tends to elevate the individual in the capitalist paradigm, but doesn't lead to actual systemic change. Now, for my part, more often than not, I happen to agree with them, but said actions need to be targeted, surgical, and there is a capricious angle to certain cuts on this album that expose how that's not always going to be the reality. Now, I'm appreciative that they're aware of this on songs like Impulse Control, and I'll give them points that the sheer strain of living under systemic racism and late capitalism, they are a functioning rationale for the rage, the emotional response, the psychological strain that could trigger that. But I'm also reminded of some of the critiques of punk that Derek Jarman included on Jubilee, not just in the commodification of the first wave of punk as empty sloganeering and aesthetic rather than the values, but also that kinetic rapture of violence that could be self-destructive beyond just those who are caught in the crossfire. Thankfully, Special Interest seems very aware of that history, and they're actually closer to building counters to it. Herman's House, solid example, referencing the 2012 documentary surrounding Herman Wallace, a Black Panther who was held in solitary confinement for decades after trying to improve the conditions at his notoriously violent prison. He designed his own dream house down to the fine details in the prayers that he could get it built upon his release, only for him to die of cancer 3 days after that release, and the planned land for it in New Orleans to get snatched up by developers. The ultimate line being where even if you're granted some escape, time in an exploitative system will ruin black lives, or in a reference to 5 Minutes of Basquiat, make them just famous enough to be commodified. It underlies the tensions within the first half of the album, where they might seem to be trying to find a reckless love on the dance floor or the nightclub, but it can't pull you away from the harsh, entrenched systems that might shape you. The psychological strain gets a reference to the 2014 TV movie 86 My Life on both foul and impulse control, but Midnight Legend gets to the core of striving for that emotive connection, even if it's within systems which would try to individualize that struggle, keep us from each other. Then you have to try to communicate across the breach, later echoed in the messy hookup on Love Scene, where some of the pain highlights at least some core of reality. That slides into Kurdish Radio, arguably one of my favorite songs on the album, where it once again challenges the colonialization of one's mind. How much we really get when American imperialism and capitalism encourage us to view life as a zero-sum game, even down to relationships where there will be winners and defined losers. I mean, maybe love isn't just an economy built on resource scarcity. The mirage of sanction. And my Displeasure highlights a deeper sense of urgency in confronting these ideas, not just with climate change as a problem that liberal capitalism is not equipped to solve, but also as someone who could very easily be cut down by police gunfire, or just that ongoing tension in one's mind that will break you down. And after the martial call to action of concerning peace, LA Blues is the moment where it snaps back to the human level, seeing the folks whose lives have been trod underfoot and pushed to the brink of their humanity. And then Ali Logout gets personal, buckling under the strain in an unfair world and her own feelings of guilt and hypocrisy living within it, where she finally reckons with the reality that the roots of it all have to come with the willingness to love and be loved in return. It's the line you gotta hold that goes beyond just the basic and intimate, the foundation of a communal movement where she admits the internal moral change is fundamental to breaking a bad system, or at least trying to build it into something new. Now, if all of this review had the feel of translating manifestos, well, yeah, but when you're stuck at the bottom of those systems, you wind up writing manifestos. You do the work that folks privileged enough to ignore it haven't heard and they don't want to hear. Again, this is all about communication. It's one of the reasons why Endure is so excellent, because it can initiate the conversation with a real sense of populism and some fun, terrific grooves. That doesn't feel like a curation of what house music can do to elevate one figure, see what I'm talking about there, but also galvanizing the true history of the genres to spark real change. And hey, if that's too much, it bangs with so much flair, variation, and potency, it's damn near impossible to ignore. It's handily one of the best albums of 2022. When I said Special Interest had so much Algiers-esque potential back in 2020, I am thrilled to see them realize the first embers of it. It's gonna fly under the radars of a lot of folks. Make the time. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I know this review is probably not going to be for everyone. Again, I got kind of political with a lot of this, but again, this is a very political album. I wanted to do it the proper due diligence and provide that analysis. And yes, it helped that I align pretty strongly with a lot of the politics, but again, there are points of tension that are worth examining, and sometimes it's worth doing the reading. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, maybe getting albums on my schedule, or help support the channel or argue with me directly on Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Please, I understand if you can't get into it, tough times, I'll be alright, but options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.